Hello everyone, this is Ed Runkle, pastor at Tapestry Church, seen here weekly on LCTV channel 66, and you may see us live every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 22 Crady Avenue. Good morning everybody, welcome to Tapestry Church. I'm so glad you're here. Hey, this morning I want to begin with the text, and this is coming from Mark's Gospel, the New Testament Gospel writer, like a biographer of Jesus, and we're going to begin at verse 30 and read through verse 37. Jesus had been healing people, and he and his disciples are on the move. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, and after 3 days, he will rise." But they did not understand the saying, and were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you discussing on the way?" But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat them down and called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." Did any of you guys happen to see the other week that Robert Mugabe, who's not a very nice man, the Zimbabwean president is his official title, and all-around awful dictator is kind of his unofficial title? Did you happen to see that he was pictured tripping the other week? Evidently, he asked the internet to take down the picture. Yeah, I'm not sure he understands how the internet works. And, I sometimes feel the same way when, I understand how life with Jesus is supposed to work, or how life as Jesus intends it is supposed to work. I mean, Jesus has all these maddening teachings, these things that destabilize our systems of trying to get over on people. He says crazy stuff like the first shall be last and the last shall be first, or if you want to find your life, then lose it, or the greatest among you must become servants. I mean, can you imagine what these disciples were thinking, that they would have this argument about who was the greatest, especially given the context that Jesus was in the midst of telling them that he was headed toward a cross. And then why couldn't they even admit to it later when he asked them what they were talking about? I mean, maybe if you're like me, this is hitting kind of close to home, because there have been lots of times in my life where I was too cowardly to ask something that should be asked. And I can think of plenty of times where I was kind of show-offy like the disciples, and then too ashamed to admit the truth of my own smallness. I mean, it makes me wonder what role fear may have played in this argument and the shame that followed. You know what I mean? Because in the end, and again, I'm just kind of being honest here, it's my desire for the story of my life to unfold in a certain way, with particular casting, props, setting, and storyline that creates a certain amount of fear in me. I mean, sometimes I'm afraid because I think I'm not going to get something I want. Other times I'm afraid because I think something that I have will be taken away. And see, while there are many things to explore in terms of when fear is good and healthy and when it's total bondage, the one thing that seems to be pretty clear about fear is that it's almost always small and self-centered. And of course, it doesn't help that in our day, as in the day of the 12, what counts is kind of being up front and being applauded, being recognized and cheered. What counts is leading the league, being the head of the class, beating out all competitors by a mile. Our culture conditions this mindset, where life is like a movie, we play the starring role, everybody else as a supporting actor to keep the spotlight on us. I mean, this is how we're conditioned, isn't it? Where this me-first mentality supposes all of life is engineered to somehow benefit us, and that we struggle to conceive the possibility that others' needs could be as important or maybe even more so than our own, just kind of confirms this ultimate form of idolatry, the idolatry of self. This, even more, this kind of me-first mentality leads us to subscribe and practice a kind of pseudo-Christianity, a form of Christianity that stems from the wrong attitude or puts the emphasis in the wrong place, aims in the wrong direction, encourages the wrong expressions. That is, authentic Christianity, authentic Christian faith is not a me-focused deal where life is a story about me. It's not a means to get what I want or to get my way. In fact, here's a little bit of a diagnostic. If you read the Bible in order to get your daily dose of advice or encouragement, or if most of your prayer life focuses on what you want from God, your faith may be a pseudo kind of faith, a quasi-Christian faith. Authentic faith, Christian faith, is Christ-centered, not me-centered. God-honoring, not me-honoring. It makes me think of a story I heard about a senior business executive who was set to fly to a very important meeting he couldn't miss, and this was following the blizzard that hit the Northeast just the other week, one of many hitting the Northeast. And so the flights had been delayed and canceled because of this storm, and hundreds of anxious travelers were on standby. Well, the executive kept crowding the podium or the counter, trying to get the airline staff to do something to move his name higher on this standby list. The agent had announced at least 4 times that those on standby should just, stay put, and their names would be called when a seat became available. Well, the executive wouldn't have anything to do with it, but kept pestering the agent, and finally, in desperation, asked her, "Do you know who I am?" Well, the agent had had enough, and picking up the microphone, she announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a man at the gate who doesn't know who he is. Would someone please come and claim him and offer him a seat in the waiting area and tell him I'll talk to him when it's his turn?" I mean, we may laugh at that story, but don't we all long for that kind of recognition, that kind of importance, for people to know who we are? It's that kind of longing that gets expressed by the disciples here in this text we're looking at this morning. And the thing that is interesting is that Jesus seems to understand this need and longing. He doesn't tell the disciples that they were being presumptuous or selfish, just that they really didn't understand, what they were asking in terms of, who might be the greatest. He doesn't climb on a chair or a table, kind of berate them from on high, or doesn't force them to sit down while he strides angrily among them, rebuking them from a posture of authority, but just gently, as they gathered around him, says, "Listen, my children, whoever wants to be most important must be the servant of all, the least of all." And he begins to draw for them a picture of the presence of a whole new world, of life in the kingdom where God reigns and all things are made right. He invites them and us to be free of this false belief that the pie is only so big and there are only so many slices, and if we place someone else's needs above our own, we might not get what we need. We might not get a piece of the pie. He invites them and us to exchange our very brittle sense of identity, our very brittle sense of place or position or status, in exchange for his status. That is, the status of a servant who's honored in the eyes of God. Jesus says, in effect, the way of the world is to rank people according to their position and power. But holy shift, that is not the way we do life in God's kingdom. It shall not be so. among you, is how he puts it the next time the subject comes up. And it comes up again in the very next chapter in Mark's biography of Jesus. See, it's like Jesus is saying, in effect, it's not about having power over people so you can prove that you're important. It's about serving so that you can show people how important they are in the eyes of God. It's not about making sure you're on top or getting to the top or getting ranked the highest to prove your worth. It's about making sure that all are included, no matter if that means you are last. See, sometimes we get so wrapped up in how we think the story of our lives should look, the cast, setting, and plot, that we think God's faithfulness to us has to look a certain way. But the fact is, sometimes God's faithfulness is actually about a better story than the way we want things to be, and about a bigger story. It's always bigger. Think about it like this. In recent weeks, vaccines and vaccinations has been in the news with measles outbreaks in various parts of the country, and it's kind of shed light on a trend referred to as anti-vaxxers, or it's a term used for parents who intentionally do not have their kids immunized. In particular, lately, against measles, or actually against measles, mumps, and rubella. Did anybody, see this or catch this in the media, or catch the medical establishment in the media use the term herd immunity? I bet it made you feel good to be categorized as livestock by the medical establishment. But seriously, herd immunity occurs when the vaccination of a significant portion of the population provides a measure of protection for individuals who've not developed immunity, or because of a compromised immune system, cannot be vaccinated. In other words, vaccination is about a bigger story than what is in it for me or what is in it for my kid. Whatever you personally believe about vaccination, it's bigger than that. It's about your neighbor. It's about a matter of the public good, and maybe even a matter of life and death. In fact, here's the test that never ceases to convict me. Which one of these questions kind of is the driver of your life? What's in it for me, or what's in it for my master? We see a true servant doesn't typically ask what's in it for me, but rather asks what's in it for my master, what's in it for heaven's sake or Jesus Christ's sake. Holy shift. We often find out the actual level of our devotion and obedience to Christ by observing how frequently we mentally ask each of those two questions in determining whether or not we do something or take some course of action. Your life is about a better story, a bigger story than what's in it for me. Now, Jesus, in his response to his disciples here, knew that he had to, bust up some stereotypes about servanthood. And probably the most prominent one in his day would have been that leaders don't serve, or that the great don't serve. Jesus knew the practice of servanthood is maybe most important for people who aspire to positions of prominence or power, because our egos are so vulnerable to pride. And so, he says, in effect, that it matters little whether a person is better educated or more accomplished. That those who live in the kingdom, they don't get a buzz from knowing that they've done something that causes them to stand out from the crowd. Nor do those in the kingdom experience that forlorn feeling that comes from knowing that they're not as successful as someone else. In fact, they view another's victory as though it were their own. Holy shift. In other words, those who follow Jesus and his way of life don't fret over their own prestige or position, nor that of others. Nor do they cling to their rights or prerogatives. They don't cling to their rank or standing as a reason for failing to love and serve others. And this, of course, is what we see in Jesus according to the New Testament record. He didn't let his own divine status hinder him from meeting the needs of sinful humanity. Instead, he pressed beyond his exalted place for the sake of love. And more than that, he became a human who would die the most ignoble of deaths, death as a tried and condemned criminal on a cross. And yet it was his humility, not counting his rights and privileges as something to use for himself, that enabled him to meet the needs of sinners like you and me. So, ministry in the name of Jesus is meeting the needs of others, or serving in the name of Jesus is meeting the needs of others, whether or not our needs are met, whether or not we feel overqualified or underqualified. Because many times when we open ourselves up to serve in Jesus' name, we find these opportunities that feel way beyond us or beyond our capacity. And other times we find these opportunities that feel beneath us, way beneath our capacity. But when we give ourselves up, our rights, and serve these needs nonetheless, it's kind of a way of being united with Christ. It's a way for us to understand what it's like for Him, on some small scale. It's a way for us to receive His life. That is, we go down with Jesus. We don't graduate above Jesus. And when we serve with Him in ways that are recognized and ways that are not, we're celebrating what He's done for us, how He completes, saves, renews us and the world through His death and resurrection. So it's not, look at me, applaud me, reward me. I mean, maybe when you first kind of, serve for the first time, it'll seem like you've done something heroic. Like, honey, I emptied the dishwasher, get this on video, call my mom. She'd love this. Maybe, when we first do something, it will feel like that. But when people asked Mother Teresa why she served, she said she did it for the joy. It no longer looked to her like she was doing something heroic. Holy shift. Or as a guy named Dallas Willard used to say, one of the signs of spiritual maturity is the thoughts that we no longer have or no longer occur to us. And he talks about if somebody wrestles with alcohol, their first day of sobriety will feel heroic for them. And they may think all through the day how hard and unusual it is that they've stayed sober. After 20 years of sobriety, though, they don't think about it nearly as much. They're free to think other, more interesting things. Now sobriety just looks like a moral sanity for which they're grateful. Well, spiritual maturity is like that. I mean, it just serves. It looks for the chance to serve. And far more often than not, these, are kind of small and seemingly inconsequential things that are so prosaic, so real that they go unnoticed and are unmarked by others. And I suspect we, even ourselves, fail to notice and remember the majority of these acts of service, but not God. I mean, God sees them all, knows them all, remembers them all, and uses them all. And just as someday we'll see the beautiful tapestry God has been weaving through our suffering and those events that we wouldn't have necessarily have chosen, in a similar way, we'll see the tapestry that God has been weaving through these simple acts of service, where we'll see how a word of encouragement or the offer of a ride or the invitation to lunch or the gift of a meal during an illness resonated in a person's or a family's heart, days, even weeks after the fact. We'll see how that small amount of money was used to accomplish something amazing. We'll see how that little shred of gospel that we were able to somehow share was like the pebble, in the shoe of a loved one or a friend who had hardened him or herself against God. I mean, think about it like this. It reminds me of this. Maybe you were able to enjoy the many commercials of the Super Bowl. Well, one of them, the nationwide commercial featuring Mindy Kaling, I thought was particularly hilarious, but also a bit of a cautionary tale. It starts with, after years of being treated like she was invisible, it occurred to Mindy that she may actually be invisible. And so the commercial shows, Mindy believes that she can do whatever she wants and get away with it. So she's seen eating ice cream in a supermarket or stealing a pastry from a coffee shop patron and going through a car wash, not in a car, but just going through the wash. And until she tries to smell Matt Damon, who responds to her, "Excuse me." And Mindy's like, can you see me? And Damon says, yes, ma'am. And for once, she isn't treated like she's invisible. Well, sometimes, seeing someone is an act of service, in a simple act. And think about all the people that may be invisible to you. A coworker or a classmate or a checkout clerk at Giant, or your server at the Olive Garden, your next door neighbor. The New Testament record, the biographies and Gospels of Jesus show that he always noticed people. He saw people in a way that made them feel special and accepted and loved. Jesus practiced radical acceptance in a way that was dangerous and upsetting and world-changing. In particular, he treated women and children, sexual sinners, and notoriously scandalous sinners with inexplicable acceptance. And maybe one small way that you can serve someone in your life this week is to see them. And to see them in such a way that shows that you're desperate for them to know that you come in peace, with a white flag flown above your head. No judgment. You're not correcting their grammar or parsing their theology. You're not gathering ammunition for a future battle, but you see them in Jesus' name and for his sake, and are with them and for them. It's interesting that Jesus takes a child and places this child in the disciples' midst to teach them the counterculture aspects of kingdom living. I mean, children in Jesus' day, what childhood was is totally different than in our day in the 21st century. Children in those days were basically replacement adults. But until then, they were treated more like mongrel dogs than they were beloved members of a family. And they weren't even really housebroken, just kind of leaked everywhere. And they died, like all the time. And infant mortality was about 30%, and then another 30% before the age of 9. These children didn't exactly take bubble baths every night being tucked into their Sesame Street bed sheets. There wasn't any sentimentality about childhood because childhood was a time of terror, really. Children were considered dirty and useless, often were unwanted. And to teach his disciples about greatness and hospitality, Jesus folds this child into his arms and says, when you welcome the likes of this child, you welcome me. I mean, why did Jesus do that? Or let me ask you this, who do you think is the stand-in for us in this text? Because if you're like me, you tend to assume that reading the New Testament that the disciples are the stand-in for us. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that it's too easy for us then to see everything Jesus says as a to-do list. And, it's kind of amazing to me how subtly but clearly my heart can communicate itself when presented with a to-do list or with an opportunity to put someone else before me or to serve in some small way. Like just the other day, my wife Bridget came home from school, prepared some macaroni and cheese for dinner because our daughter was going to have a friend over for dinner and a night at the theater and a sleepover. Bridget needed to go back to school to pick up our daughter and friend following a rehearsal for the school musical. And she asked me if I would simply take this already prepared dish of macaroni and cheese and place it in the oven before I went out for a run. And it's amazing how I can say, Okay, I'll put it in the oven. In other words, you've successfully placed this burden on me. I'll do it because I can't think of a smooth way out of it. But, I'll make my response in this moment unpleasant enough to make it less likely that you'll ask me the next time. Am I the only person who ever does this? Does anybody else know what I'm talking about? When you're dropping Julia off at, the school dance, would you pick up Charlotte and Lauren on the way? I guess, if I have to. You know what happened? I actually went out running and forgot to put that dish in the oven. No kidding. I was, a mile or so from my house. I ran like I haven't run in years to get back to get that dish in the oven because it was out on the countertop, and we live in a home with a dog who is the queen of countertop surfing. But here's what I'm trying to get at. About that child Jesus folds into his arms. What if it's the child that is the stand-in for us and not the disciples? What if we really believe the childish parts of us, like the parts of a first-century child, who is considered useless, who has, dried snot wiped across his unwashed face, and a child who can't actually understand Jesus' teaching, has nothing to offer, is someone no one wants around or maybe doesn't even notice. A child who has zero ability to make herself worthy. What if we believe that these are the parts of us that Jesus folds into his arms and says, welcome? Wouldn't that change everything? How often, like the disciples, do our times of cowardice and boasting and fear come from the fact that we don't know or don't believe that, like a child in the lap of God, there's really no longer any basis for our insecurity, because God folds into God's arms that which is filthy and worthless and unable to help itself and says, welcome. There's simply no longer any basis to not have humility, to not love, to not serve, to not put someone else ahead of us. Holy shift. Thank you for joining us at Tapestry Church this morning. We hope you enjoyed the message. For more information, you may check out our website or Facebook page, and you may see us live weekly at 22 Crady Avenue at 10:30. All are welcome.